In the early 80s, the British independent scene had really started. It grew out of Rough Trade Records, the Rough Trade record shop having its own distribution system, and it grew out of Rob Gretton's decision not to take Joy Division to Warner Brothers, but to do their first album, Unknown Pleasures, on Factory. And this created the indie scene, and the indie scene was beginning to blossom. And obviously, Factory, Mute, 4AD, then Creation, everybody, it dominated the 80s and was wonderful. But it wouldn't have happened if Morrissey hadn't have signed to Rough Trade, because in 1980 to 82, Rough Trade distribution was getting into financial difficulties. And to be quite honest, every time they had a Depeche Mode album, they'd pay us for the last Joy Division album they couldn't pay for. And then when they got the Joy Division album, they'd pay Mute for their Depeche Mode album they couldn't pay them for. And this was going on. If they hadn't have signed the Smiths and had that wonderful success, then, to be quite honest, I don't think Rough Trade would have survived. Rough Trade would have gone bust, leaving us with the one distributor we were with, Pinnacle, who themselves went bankrupt in 1983, at which point we would all have given up or gone to the majors. So the British independent scene was preserved by Morrissey signing with Johnny to Rough Trade.
I think the Smiths being on Rough Trade was hugely important, hugely important. And people forget now exactly how important that independent mindset was and what it meant in terms of British music at that point, because the early 80s, the airwaves were filled with sort of syrupy keyboard bands. I mean, people talked about keyboard washes.
We've got all these synthesizer duos and all kind of with mixing metaphor, really corny as hell metaphorical lyrics with 18-syllable names.
Everything was, music was just horrendous, and it was very synthetic, and it was very fake, and it was, the pop star was back.
By joining Rough Trade, when they could have joined any number of majors, I mean, they did a session for EMI and could have signed to EMI in '82. But to go with Rough Trade was a real statement of intent. And the first album, particularly, is the classic independent album, because it's just the four of them. Nothing's really augmented or tarted up. The quality of the musicianship shines through, even though the production values maybe weren't all the band wanted them to be.
What people didn't realise or didn't get was that the Smiths had, or Morrissey Marr, let's say, who were contractually the Smiths, had a profit-sharing agreement with Rough Trade, so they're getting 50%. So they were actually doing far better by being with Rough Trade than if they'd gone to a major record company.
Despite what appeared to have been a mutually beneficial arrangement, the course of 1985 seemed to have irrevocably soured relations between the band and their label. As the major sessions for The Queen is Dead got underway in September, the tension had bubbled over into a dispute that threatened to completely derail the album's release.
I think there was some incident halfway through the album of Johnny coming down and taking all the master tapes from the studio. Again, which I think was trying to force someone's hand in the label to agree to certain things, but I was never totally sure. My job was to get on making a record. All that political stuff in the background, I left, I wasn't getting involved in that.
The dispute with Rough Trade did affect the band very badly, and it turned out to be very disruptive. Most crucially of all, it delayed the release of The Queen is Dead for 8 months because, Rough Trade took an injunction out to prevent them from leaving the label.
The source of the dispute between the Smiths and Rough Trade was the failure of the record label to promote the records in a way which would have put them onto the level that they deserved to be on in 85, 86. I know Jeff Travis, the head of Rough Trade, had said that the records weren't good enough, the singles weren't good enough. But actually, in the context of that time, I think that some of those songs are absolutely fantastic. Also, there were problems between the Smiths and Radio 1 as well. I think Morrissey had been quite critical of Radio 1 and more or less accused them of blacklisting the Smiths. And as a result, Steve Wright had come out and said that he wouldn't be playing any more Smiths songs. So there was a real sort of background of awkwardness going into 86. There was a sense that all wasn't well, and that they'd really maybe pushed themselves too far for all sorts of reasons, and that it was becoming an increasing struggle to keep a lid on whatever personal problems they had at that point.
And in early '86, the lid blew off in spectacular fashion. A tour of Ireland exposed bassist Andy Roark as a heroin addict, with his near comatose performances and withdrawn behaviour casting a wide shadow over the whole trip.
The whole Irish tour, the realisation that Andy had a problem, that was pretty scary, you know, because we'd been the gang. We'd always been the gang. During the Irish tour, I suddenly realised that Andy wasn't locking with Johnny anymore. From a musical point of view, I was like, that was a mistake. You know, I'd never heard mistakes before.
It was bad. I mean, on various levels, not just because of what was happening to Andy Roark, but what that was seen to represent in the world of the Smiths. I mean, it was generally known that Morrissey was anti-drugs. You know, heroin addiction, I don't know, it was just so un-Smiths-like. They were considered to be different. The big word at the time in 1985, 86 was rockist, which seems to be about the worst thing you could say about somebody in the indie world, at least, is to accuse them of being rockist. And a member of a group submitting to heroin or being a heroin addict was considered probably the most rockish thing you could do. Roark had broken the unwritten rule of what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to act as a Smith. I think because of that, you know, it wasn't any great surprise that he was sacked from the group.
Johnny Marr quickly set about trying to fill the new vacancy on bass and eventually invited former Aztec camera guitarist Craig Gannon to perform the role. However, after only a couple of weeks in the wilderness, a penitent Andy Roark was readmitted to the Smiths. Mindful of the potential demands performing The Queen is Dead would make on their sound, the group retained Gannon as a second guitarist, in preparation for the album's eventual release.
Johnny had known of me through a friend of his called Cy Wollstonecroft. He was a drummer in sort of an early formation of the Smiths, so he'd played with them a little bit, but he was a friend of Johnny's and Mike and Andy's as well. So I knew him, and they sort of introduced us through that way. Johnny rang us up and asked if I'd come down to his house, in his studio. He had a studio in his house. He said, if you fancy playing bass in the band now, replacing Andy, you know, you can do it if you fancy it. But as I'm not a bass player, I wasn't a bass player at that time anyway. I was a guitar player. It didn't really appeal to me. So the next I'd heard really was Andy was back in the band after being sacked. I think Morrissey had left a note on his window or something saying, "You've left the Smiths." So he had sort of left, and then he was back in the band within probably a few weeks really. Then the first rehearsals I had with him was with Andy and Mike, you know, and Johnny. So it was the full band back together again.
With the band newly constructed as a five-piece, The Queen is Dead was finally slated for release in the summer of '86. The album's lead single, Big Mouth Strikes Again, was issued in May and represented an enormous statement from the band, with its edgy rock sound and innovative studio effects, supporting another round in Morrissey's battle with the British press.
I think Big Mouth Strikes Again was one of the best Smiths singles, and musically, just the whole way it starts. It's got that fantastic bit of Marr guitar work and then Joyce coming in.
Johnny Marr had said, you know, he wanted single status like the Stones and the Who, and I thought he achieved that on Big Mouth Strikes Again. He told me he saw it as the Smiths' Jumping Jack Flash, and I understood precisely what he meant. Jumping Jack Flash was a fantastic rock and roll riff, and I think Big Mouth Strikes Again was the same.
Johnny Marr said he wanted to create a song that had a rush all the way through it, a bit like the Rolling Stones' Jumping Jack Flash. And he achieves this by using a galloping rhythm, which is formed by a quaver followed by two semiquavers. It sounds like this rhythm. As a sort of propulsive and forward-moving kind of feel to it.
The guitars on Big Mouth, there's quite a lot of layers going on. I mean, I think about 3, if not 4 acoustics make up that opening kind of guitar line, you know. Different tunings and capos on different parts of the neck, different inversions of so it's quite multi-layered, and it has got a Stonesy type feel to it. You know, even with that woo-hoo, you know, the backing vocal thing that kind of comes in, it's kind of, you know, shades of Sympathy for the Devil, you know. So there was a bit of a Stonesy type vibe to it, and that kind of hazy, kind of multi-layered, kind of little guitar lines on top of each other.
Sometimes Johnny would start the song on his own. When we play live on the Queen is Dead tour, Johnny would start it on his own. We'd both play on electrics. Other times we both started together. And the main rhythm part was...
The harmony effects that are on Morrissey's voice were just me putting his vocal through a harmonizer, pitching it up a third or something, and feeding it back into the desk, you know, and it kind of gave this kind of otherworldly, kind of little high-pitched voice that kind of, I thought sounded a bit strange, but he was kind of really into the idea, so it stayed in the mix. Again, it was just seeing what we could do in the studio with what we had to play with, you know. I remember I wanted to get a bit more snap into that long snare roll that carried on through it, so I remember sampling one of Mike's snare hits into an AMS and triggering it so it had a bit more of a snap to it.
It was a bold statement by Morrissey. It was almost a backs to the wall style statement, because he was really getting hammered in certain quarters for some of the things he was saying, and it was almost the case, I think, that he seemed to feel that people wanted him to go away and disappear, and this was him sort of coming out fighting and saying, you know, I'm not going anywhere, and actually I'm going to be more irritating, and you haven't seen the last of me.
One's relationship with the music press is incredibly complicated. There's lots of different writers and they're individuals and they have different opinions, so you mustn't believe too much about what you read about yourself. It's a tool. Music press is a tool. It's part of the ecosystem of the music business. And to misunderstand that is to misunderstand everything if you want to sort of succeed in it.
I thought it was quite important to come forth and confront people and to look people in the eyes and say quite specific, strong things instead of poetic, esoteric, veiled things that people had to. People needed streams of notes to understand. It was very important just to say...
His comments on CND, the IRA, Margaret Thatcher, royalty, you know, any subject you threw at him, he'd come back with the most press-worthy quotes imaginable, and wonderfully iconoclastic stuff. And at the same time, he was always knee-deep in controversies as a result of what he said, and particularly when it got translated by the tabloid press. Morrissey says something particularly about royalty or whatever. This was a time before the fall of the royals in public perception. The press still was defensive of royalty, and Morrissey was unrelenting in his comments.
And unrelenting was a word that many would use to describe the changes that swept across Britain in the mid-80s. A wave of strikes and protests against the reforms of Margaret Thatcher, civil war within the Labour Party, and a growing divide between North and South formed a highly charged backdrop to Morrissey's controversial public statements. When The Queen is Dead was released on the 16th of June 1986, its opening excerpt from working class cinema and searing attack on the monarchy pushed the Smiths to the forefront of the national conversation.
There's something extraordinary about the Smiths in '86, something extraordinary about The Queen is Dead in terms of the sound of the music and also the subject matter, and that juxtaposition between Morrissey's worldview and Marr's genius as a guitarist, supported by Roark and Joyce, who I think are probably two of the hardest players in terms of physical sound. There's a real sense of working class anger about that album.